Introducing myself, my name is David Swanson. The United States government recently gave more than $1 million to the family of one victim it had killed in one of its wars. The victim happened to be Italian. If you were to find all the Iraqi families with any surviving members who had loved ones killed by the United States, it might be about 1 million families. 1 million times $1 million would be enough to treat those Iraqis in this respect as if they were Europeans. Who can tell me? Raise your hand. How much is 1 million times 1 million? Right here. 1 trillion. Now, can you please count to 1 trillion starting with 1? Go ahead, we'll wait. You can. The problem with that is it would take, if you got to one number every second, it would take 31,709 years. And we have other speakers to get to. So 1 trillion is a number that, in fact, the human brain cannot comprehend. For most purposes, it is utterly useless. The greediest oligarch does not dream of ever seeing a fraction of that many dollars. Teeny fractions of that many dollars would transform the world. 3% of it per year would end starvation on Earth. 1% of it per year would end the lack of clean drinking water on the globe. 10% of it per year would transform green energy or agriculture or education. 3% of it per year for 4 years in current dollars was the Marshall Plan. And yet, the United States government, through numerous departments, dumps $1 trillion per year, every year, into preparing for wars. So that works out perfectly. You take 1 year off, you compensate the Iraqi victims. Take some additional months off, begin compensating Afghans, Libyans, Syrians, Pakistanis, Yemenis, Somalis, etc. Not going to list them all, the 31,709 year problem, but there are more. Of course, you can never fully compensate a destroyed country like Iraq or a family anywhere that has lost a loved one. But you could benefit millions and billions of people every year and save and improve millions and billions of lives for less than is spent preparing for more wars. And this is the number one way in which war kills, by taking away money from anything else. Globally, it's $2 trillion a year plus trillions of dollars in damage and destruction. When you try to weigh the good and the bad to decide whether starting or continuing a war is justified, on the bad side has to go the cost, financial, moral, human, environmental, etc., of war preparations. Even if you think you can imagine how there could be a justifiable war someday, you have to consider whether it's justifiable in the way that a corporation that pollutes the earth and abuses its workers and customers is profitable, namely by writing off most of the costs. Of course, people like to imagine that there have been a few justifiable wars, so that the chance of another one outweighs all the destruction of endless war preparation, plus all the unjustifiable wars that preparation produces. The United States simply had to fight a revolution against England. Although nonviolent corrections to injustices were working damn well, and the reason that Canada hasn't had to fight a revolution against England yet is because there are no touchdowns in hockey or something. The United States simply had to kill 750,000 people and then end slavery, even though slavery didn't end, because all of those other countries that ended slavery without doing that, and this city we are sitting in that ended slavery without doing that, lack the valuable heritage of the Confederate flag and all the bitter racist resentment we so cherish, or something. World War II was totally justifiable because President Roosevelt was 6 days off in his prediction of the Japanese attack he'd worked to provoke. The U.S. and England refused to evacuate Jewish refugees from Germany. The Coast Guard chased a ship of them away from Miami. The State Department denied Anne Frank's visa request. All peace efforts to halt the war and liberate the camps were blocked. Several times the number of people who died in the camps died outside of them in the war. The all-out destruction of civilians and the permanent militarization of the United States have been disastrous precedents. The fantasy of Germany taking over the Western Hemisphere just as soon as it took over the Soviet Union was based on forged documents of Karl Rovian quality. The United States gave syphilis to its Negro soldiers during the war and to Guatemalans during the Nuremberg trials, and the U.S. military hired hundreds of former top Nazis at the end of the war, and they fit right in. But this was a question of good versus evil. This new trend of pitching wars as philanthropy picks up a sliver of U.S. public support, but each such war relies on greater support from those who thirst for blood. And because no humanitarian war has yet benefited humanity, this propaganda leans heavily on wars that did not happen. 5 years ago, one simply had to bomb Libya because of Rwanda, where U.S.-backed militarism had created the disaster, and never would bombing anybody have helped anything. A few years later, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, openly and shamelessly wrote that we had a responsibility not to look at the disaster in Libya in order to be properly willing to bomb Syria. And we had to bomb Syria because Rwanda. And also because Kosovo, where the propaganda had featured a photograph of a thin man behind a fence. In reality, the photographer had been behind the fence, and there had been a fat man cropped out next to the thin man. But the point was to bomb Serbia, to fuel atrocities, in order to prevent the Holocaust, which the U.S. government at the time of World War II had absolutely zero interest in stopping. So let's try to get this straight once and for all. It is to our credit that wars have to be marketed to us as being good for people. But we are well-meaning fools if we believe it. Wars must end, and the even more damaging institution of war preparation must be abolished. And I do not expect that we can, and I'm not sure that we should, abolish the U.S. military by next Thursday, but it is important that we understand the necessity and the desirability of abolishing it so that we can begin taking steps that move us in that direction. A series of steps might look like this. 1, stop arming other countries and groups. 2, create U.S. support for and participation in institutions of law, nonviolence, diplomacy, and aid as developed in the book that's in your packets, A Global Security System, An Alternative to War. End ongoing wars. 4, take the U.S. down to no more than twice the next leading military spender, investing in transition to a peaceful, sustainable economy. 5, close foreign bases. 6, eliminate weapons that lack any defensive purpose. 7, take the U.S. down to no more than the next leading military spender and continue to keep pace with a reverse arms race. There is no doubt that the United States would trigger a universal reverse arms race if it led it. 8, eliminate nuclear and other of the worst weapons. A nice step would be for the U.S. to join the ban on cluster bombs now that the U.S. has momentarily stopped producing them. 9, establish a timetable for the total elimination of war. Even the necessary wars, even the just wars, the good and glorious wars, yes, but if it's any consolation, they don't exist. There is no need to be arming the world to the teeth. It is not economically beneficial or morally justifiable in any way. Wars today have U.S. weapons on both sides, on multiple sides. ISIS videos have U.S. guns and U.S. videos. It's not just. It's not glorious. It's merely greedy and stupid. Studies like Erica Chenoweth's that David Hart so mentioned have established that nonviolent resistance to tyranny is far more likely to succeed, those successes to be longer lasting than with violent resistance. So if we look at something like the nonviolent revolution in Tunisia in 2011, we might find that it meets all the criteria for a supposedly just war, except that it wasn't a war at all. And you wouldn't go back in time and argue for a strategy less likely to succeed while guaranteed to result in lots of pain and death. Despite the relative scarcity of examples thus far of nonviolent resistance to foreign occupations, there are those already beginning to claim a pattern of success there too. Here's a quote from Stephen Zunis, quote, "During the first Palestinian Intifada in the 1980s, much of the subjugated population effectively became self-governing entities through massive non-cooperation and the creation of alternative institutions, forcing Israel to allow the creation of the Palestine Authority and self-governance for most of the urban areas of the West Bank. Nonviolent resistance in the occupied Western Sahara has forced Morocco to offer an autonomy proposal. In the final years of German occupation of Denmark and Norway during World War II, the Nazis effectively no longer controlled the populations. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia freed themselves from Soviet occupation through nonviolent resistance prior to the collapse of the USSR. In Lebanon, 30 years of Syrian domination was ended through a large-scale nonviolent uprising in 2005." End quote. He has more examples, and one might, I think, look at numerous examples of resistance to the Nazis and German resistance to the French invasion of the Ruhr in 1923, perhaps the one-time success in the Philippines and the ongoing success in Ecuador of evicting U.S. military bases, and of course the Gandhian example of kicking the British out of India. But the far more numerous examples of nonviolent success over domestic tyranny also provide a guide toward future action. On the side of choosing a nonviolent response to an attack is its greater likelihood of succeeding and of that success lasting longer, as well as less damage being done in the process. Sometimes we get so busy pointing out that anti-U.S. terrorism is fueled by U.S. aggression, as it is, that we forget to point out that the terrorism fails in its objectives, just as the larger U.S. terrorism fails in its objectives. Iraqi resistance to U.S. occupation is not a model for U.S. resistance to some fantasized invasion of the United States by Vladimir Putin and Edward Snowden leading a wild band of Muslim Hondurans to come and take our guns away. The right model is nonviolent non-cooperation, the rule of law, diplomacy, and that can begin now. And the chance of violent conflicts can be enormously minimized. In the absence of an attack, however, which is all the actual wars, while claims are being made that a war should be launched as a supposed last resort, nonviolent solutions are available in infinite variety and can be tried over and over again. The United States has never actually reached the point of attacking another country as an actual and literal last resort, and it never can. If you could achieve that, then a moral decision would still require that the imagined benefits of your war outweigh all the damage done by maintaining the institution of war, and that is an incredibly high hurdle. What we need in order to bring nonviolent pressure to bear on whoever occupies the White House and the Capitol 4 months from now is a larger, more energized movement for the abolition of war with a vision of what we could have instead. During World War II, before the United States maintained a permanent state of war, a congressman from Maryland suggested that after the war, the Pentagon could be turned into a hospital and thereby be put to some useful purpose. I still think that's a good idea. I might mention that to the Pentagon staff when we go there at 9 a.m. on Monday. You should all come. This is the vision we need to advance, one in which a new and valuable purpose must be found, as in these necklaces made of recycled nuclear weapons, for everything that used to be part of the immoral criminal enterprise that was called war. Thank you. Thank you.